right, yes, I'm online a little bit early. I got set up well in advance, so just checking a couple of things, make sure everything's working. Everything appears to be working just fine. I can see that StreamYard is doing its job. So, anyways, a quick ramble. So you can see up in the top right-hand corner that I have a new logo. That is better known as the Personal Trainers Academy. It's a new school that I'm going to launch. I think the first course I'm offering is going to actually be in June. So for those people who have friends or needing to get certified in personal training, have a general interest in upgrading their own personal inventory and toolbox as far as being able to develop their own workouts and do so injury-free and progressively, I have a possible course for you to sign up for, plus various ongoing educational opportunities, CECs, et cetera, that we'll be putting out for those people that are already certified personal trainers. So website's being developed right now, super exciting. And it all started with the logo. So without further ado, you can see that the title up on the screen right now is addressing dead zones, active passive range differences. So the major issue here is to understand what mobility is and call it like a mobility makeover, in the sense that certain techniques can be used to help address what I would call neurological inefficiencies in the body. So one of the ways to kind of assess whether or not you have a neurological inefficiency or an inability to access available ranges of motion to you is to look at this concept of an active passive range difference, which we've previously discussed in another seminar. So today I'm going to do a few more active demonstrations and walk you through the logic progression, a few of them. I can't say I've got it all covered off, but I've covered off a lot of the key components as we go through this. So anyway, last thing I will say before getting into the actual seminar is that a lot of the reason why I do these seminars is specifically to try out new material, things that I'm going to do seminars on later in the summer, various conferences that are coming up in August, September, et cetera. A lot of times I like to put together the information and start to play it out and see where I have gaps in my information or where things went really well, and sort of just like have a constant ongoing update. So the reason why you guys get the benefit from me posting these things on an ongoing basis, because I'm literally trying out new material on you, which means that it's relatively cutting edge too. So that's kind of cool. This slide you may have seen before. One of the key ingredients to understand is that most injuries occur at end ranges of motion where tissue is actively being loaded, but that the fascial and contractile elements, so the fascial elements have to do their job. The spring mechanism and all the active components that are inside the fascia have to sort of pick up tension at the end range of motion. So if you look at various other seminars I presented, there's a place where the passive components, the fascial system and those natural spring back mechanisms have to kind of take over and do their job. But if we have a really efficient neurological system, the difference between where active and passive exist at the end range of motion becomes very small, and therefore both systems, both the contractile system and the passive elements of the fascial system, can come together to actually create effective, efficient movement patterns. So one of the things I like to look at very carefully is if there's an active passive range difference. Now, like anything else, there's some of you are going to be listening to this going, well, what about this and what about that? And you didn't cover this and you didn't cover that. I can only do so much in a short seminar, so I'm going to really focus on those people that do not have major capsular issues, which means that at the end range of motion, that active passive range difference, when you get to, has a springiness in it, doesn't have a hard stop, meaning that it's likely not anatomy on anatomy or fibrotic joints that are causing a lack of range of motion because it's just not enough space for motion to occur in. So if we want to get deeper into joint articulations, joint ranges of motion, etc., I would highly recommend FRC, which is Functional Range Conditioning by Andrea Spinia and his team. So if we look at what the difference between active and passive is, and this is myself and Shelly, and there's some components here. So as much as this looks like a simple demonstration, there's still things like, for example, she's stabilizing my left pelvis. That was me feet up against the wall, abducting my leg as far as I possibly could without rotating my pelvis off to the side. So as you can see, that's the range of motion I have actively. Then from Really quick, Shelly, give me stabilizing my hips. This is a range of motion that was available to me easily with springiness at the end. So it was another, better part of 12 inches of range of motion. And that thing is called the dead zone, right? So that area is a neurological dead zone, which means I have the ability, the tissue extensibility is available to me, the joint capsule space is available to me, but yet I can't access it through my own cognitive voluntary contraction, which therefore means I have a potential neurological dead zone, which means I have a potential to access a range of motion and not have my nervous system respond in appropriate receptive or appropriate manner to absorb impact, to absorb force, to slow down any velocities that are occurring at high velocity, because I can't get the contractile elements to fire at that time in a synchronous, in a very fluid, effective way, and that'll create timing in a muscle contraction that will stop any potential injury risk from occurring by putting extra load into the joint and the tendon. So a real simple sort of idea here is this concept here is like, if I was to look at what's called a sleeper stretch, for example, which is a very simple one to do, is you get down, lay down sideways, which I'm going to do right now. So if I get into a sideline position, like so, okay, and I get my arm at 90 degrees, and I focus on keeping my shoulder down so there's no extraneous joint motions that are occurring. So if I do that, and then this is my active range of motion before anything occurs biomechanically in my joint. So I run out of joint space right now, run out of active range of motion. And the question becomes, do I have more passive range of motion without a biomechanical change of pattern? So active, passive, the difference between active and passive being my neurological dead zone. So obviously for healthy shoulders, it's really important, particularly the mobility of joints in general, ankles, hips, shoulders, thorax, things that where you have a great deal of range of motion available to you, particularly in three dimensions, in all possible directions. It's essential to realize that if we have an active passive range difference, it's essential that we take that as a first step towards our mobility program, is to start to understand that there's a scientific language, there's a scientific set of mobility principles that must be applied versus just randomly attaching a band to my hip, randomly doing a stretching program that I found on the internet. You need to take a very strategic approach to it. So you need to go joint by joint, motion by motion, and start to look at common things that are required. So you can either be for a 360-degree full integration approach, or you can take more of a specific to what I need approach. The more comprehensive you are, the better, but the reality is you don't have to be fully comprehensive. Maybe I'm just focusing on getting into a much better squat pattern, because if we start to look at it and break it down and go, well, what's our start point, and how do I know I have an active passive range difference to even begin to examine? Because we looked at how to examine it previously, but now why, where we go there, and what's the decision matrix going into it. So this is just some simple basic concepts in terms of understanding how to create, use your body weight, use gravity. Doesn't require any complicated equipment to understand this concept. And then the application in here in terms of the arrows, we'll get into a bit deeper. The key ingredient to look at this slide beyond the basic demonstration is that a lot of restricted range of motion is actually articular and removal of joint spaces. Because of inactivity, we have a lot of fibrotic material. Fibrosis occurs on a daily basis, and unless you're moving the joints and sort of just cleaning out that area, and that's the difference between cleaning out an area and removing fibrosis to overusing an area and having abrasive scraping occurring where joints wear down over time. So it's a fine line, it's a difficult process, but again, understanding this active passive range is one of the excellent places to start from. And the concept we're going to apply today is a little bit of this idea of active, passive, active, which means there's an active range of motion, there's a passive range of motion, and then we're going to add active range of motion over top of that to engage that dead zone and hopefully over time remove it. And then talk about, if you've attempted to do this without success, what's my decision matrix? So to give you an idea, and this is just something I whipped up to give us an idea of some of the decision matrix that goes on. I mean some too, because this is very, very rudimentary compared to how things go, but some ideas are in here, and it's a very good overview of what actually goes on. So start one is that I'm watching someone do a split squat. I'm watching someone do a push-up, a push, a pull, a squat, a lunge, and all of a sudden I see that there's a change in the biomechanics in that movement pattern long before full range of motion. Something has to happen. So you're trying to create space. You're either trying to move in and out of space. You're trying to move in or away from stability because of a lack of or more of available to you. So end of the day, we see a biomechanical change or I detect what I call an error detection or a movement error. So that movement error means that the path I expect it to occur did not occur. So therefore I go, oh, or from a postural static posture perspective, not dynamic, like someone who sits at a desk all day long, got a head forward posture, rounded shoulders. Someone's got an arch in the lower back from overactivity in the hip flexors and the erector spinae muscles, and underactivity in, say, the hamstrings and the abdominal region, as a simple sort of overview of what lower cross is, that then needs help to activate the right set of muscles, because inside of those patterns are overactive muscles and underactive muscles, and tissue tightness and tissue extensibility. So sometimes being in either way, we're constantly looking through that matrix to go, well, what do we need to work on? How do I decide what to do? So if I look at mobility as a catch-all phrase, the first thing I notice is that it's limited. So someone has a mobility restriction. So I do a straight leg raise assessment, and their range is suboptimal. They're not at 90 degrees, which in this sort of standard equation is the optimal range of motion for daily normal activities. If I'm a figure skater, that's a different ball game. If I'm a goaltender, soccer goalie, wrestler, various other gymnasts, that type of thing, then obviously I would need more range of motion, and therefore that standard would be very different. Regardless, so the point is, we've found that mobility is limited because we've done some kind of mobility assessment, whether it be my functional movement assessment, whether it be FMS, whether it be some other system of orthopedic range of motion tests, etc. From that place, I'm then going to make decisions. I go, okay, well, I know there's a restriction. Now, is that restriction also accompanied with an active passive range difference? Yes or no? If it's a yes, there's an active passive range difference like there was in my sleeper, then I'm going to apply a technique called end range of motion APA, which means at the end range of motion, I'm going to have, here's my active range of motion. I'm going to guide into passive range of motion, and then I'm going to apply an active strength pattern to that end range to start to talk to the nervous system and make the nervous system recognize it's safe to be out there. The nervous system doesn't have information about that space right now, so we're going to start firing information into that space. So the result of that is that I'm trying to find a way to make the brain recognize it's okay to be in this place. It's a pain-free, available range of motion that we've just not used for a long period of time, and therefore it's not easily accessible without some training. That's what good training is all about. Or, no, there is no active passive range difference. So we have a mobility restriction, but there is no active passive range restriction. So therefore, then we go down different pathways. So pathway on the no active passive range difference says, okay, let's try mild compression techniques, which means foam rolling. Various forms of foam rolling, various forms of massage, ART, and all soft tissue release techniques or compression techniques designed to increase tissue extensibility. That even could be static stretching done for a long held period of time. So regardless, therefore the goal is tissue extensibility. So on the right, I'm strengthening, or on the left of this diagram, active passive range difference exists. I'm going to strengthen the pattern. No active passive range difference. My first attempt is going to be, well, let's do anything we can to increase tissue extensibility. So whatever techniques I want to apply, in my case, the quickest, easiest way to access range of motion from a tissue extensibility issue is some form of massage or some form of pin and move technique where there's compression and then you're pinning and moving, creating a glide between the surfaces. There can be deeper issues. That's a whole scar tissue, etc. That's a whole different ball game, and not something that's going to be covered off today. But again, those things are referral mechanisms, as you'll see at the bottom. So, okay, we've got an active passive range difference. So, boom, we apply end range motion APA, which we're going to walk through in a minute. If there's an improvement, boom, we move on to the next step. So we're going to progress the pattern, which you're going to see in the next slide. If there's no improvement, then we have to take another shot. So let's try another pathway into the nervous system. In this case, we're going to talk about what's a gamma reset or stimulation. So we can do muscle stim techniques. So that's things we're using percussion technique. That's where you're doing what's called MAT, muscle activation technique. Again, if you're an applied practitioner in one of those areas where you have specific skills or it's within your scope of practice, by all means, you can go to that pattern. So if there's improvement, we progress. Okay, so that's sort of the idea. If there's not improvement, we regress. And as you can see from these patterns, there's a whole set of questions and answers going on all the way. And therefore, where I am in this table dictates my next step. So again, the point of the matter is that there's a functional continuum, right? You're injured, you don't have functions. You have an acute tissue or trauma to that joint that's supporting the tissue. Involved with the tissue, or you have low function, which means that maybe you're rehabbing, maybe you're on your way back to play, what I refer to it as, or maybe you're just relatively new to exercise and therefore you're fairly low on the functional progression continuum and haven't really worked on the mobility patterns and haven't taken a strategic approach to it. So our functions might be relatively low for a number of different reasons, but it usually basically means that we've been vibrating at a relatively low level, either due to injury or due to inactivity. So the result of that is that then we have to take the approach that we're working from low function and hopefully progressing our way to high function. So whenever there's an improvement, using the technique that you're using, and that improvement's relatively stable, meaning it lasts for more than a few minutes, it's a clear indication that you're doing the right thing. And there's a simple rule when it comes to biomechanics and when it comes to movement patterning: do more of what it likes, less of what it dislikes. So if the pattern changes, but then quickly regresses back to its previous range of motion or previous level of function, that means that whatever you did wasn't able to stick in the nervous system, and the nervous system's feedback mechanism wasn't able to drive a persistent, consistent change. If there is a consistent change, it could still regress, because whatever pattern you're doing in life, whatever pattern you're doing in training, whatever pattern you're doing in sport may be causing some tissues to be overused and some tissues to be underused, some range of motions to be actively engaged upon and other range of motions to not be touched. So therefore, dead zones may reappear due to your lifestyle. And if that's the case, we got to start looking at, okay, we got to dig deeper. So if there's no improvement, we got to look further down this table, right? We got to keep going down that table until we get that thing called an improvement. Once we have improvement, then we go up the functional progression stage, right, where we start looking at functional progressions. And those functional progressions are going to be load, speed, range of motion, volume of work, complexity of motion, etc. So we move along. So we assume that's the logic process, right? And again, at the end of the day, there's strategies involved, right? We're trying to create mobility around stability. It's not like we want one or the other. We want both. So, and you can call it tissue extensibility around stability, because technically the idea of mobility is active range of motion, which has a component of stability built into it. But there are certain techniques that are not uncommon to see in this area. So again, you can see I've got techniques that a lot of people can do on their own, and then there's techniques, for example, that should be referred out. Same idea applies here. You have tissue extensibility, active range of motion, which is what we're calling mobility, and instability would be more of these positional isometrics or strength loading patterns, so loading a movement pattern. So we start getting into things like planks and side planks and bridges, which are really positional isometrics, getting into reactive neuromuscular training, so getting into a range of motion, then creating joint perturbations and joint loading at a specific range of motion, particularly where there might have been a previous mechanical breakdown. And then another way is what I call muscle activation at end range of motion. That's a very specific technique that I've created, where we look at removing the dead zone and then gamma resetting that range of motion, sending information into the muscle spindles and the intra and extrafusal fibers in such a way that allows the gamma motor neuron to start sending information to the brain, and the brain feeding that information back in a useful way. So once that's all done, then we can actually start loading a program, which means an integrated movement pattern like a push, a pull, a squat, a lunge, etc. Oh, I don't want to go deep into this because I'm going to actually try to work through it a little bit, but there is a little bit of information to be aware in here. There's two approaches here. One is when you do what is called a PNF technique, or a proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation. There are crack techniques. There are various other techniques. Crack is my preferred way to do this, which is contract, relax, antagonist, contract. But the percentage or intensity of the contraction, there's some debate over what's required. So depending on what practitioner group you come from, if you're an FRC instructor, you will likely have been taught, unless things have changed, that a isometric contraction of the agonist is done at a 80 to 100%. It's done at pretty max effort. It's on like Donkey Kong, push, 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 and then relax. And that's what I was initially taught from several perspectives. And then a lot of where my philosophy started to change, looking at some recent research that's come out about lower level agonist contraction, somewhere in that 20 to 40% range, where the initial contraction of the agonist, or the tight muscle, is less than a high intensity contraction. It's relatively low. It's great for joints that have been previously injured. It's a very soft technique that seems to have very similar results than using 100% of maximum effort. So anyway, so the point is, when you watch me do this, my contraction levels in the agonist, or the first part of the APA, will actually be relatively low, okay, versus high. You can go high as well, particularly if you got a healthy athletic population where there's been no history of joint injury or no current injuries occurring. Then you can go all out and maybe benefit from it just a tiny bit more. And I'll show you what both of those look like. So the mistake a lot of people make is when they do this type of work. So for example, one of the first ones we're going to work through is my knee flexion range of motion. So just to give you an idea, okay? So this is me flexing my knee actively. There's where I am, and there's my passive range of motion. Active range of motion, passive range of motion. There's a significant active passive range difference, and most people have this, to be clear, okay? So if that's the case, the next steps are to get rid of that dead zone, and that's going to be one of the first patterns we're going to actually demonstrate. So point is, we want to continue until there's no further range of motion improvement, and we want to start each new rep at the previous range of motion. Now, doing this to yourself versus having a practitioner with skills working with you is a little more tricky to realize and manage all these moving parts, but it's still very doable. So now, all I'm doing here is reapplying that table and then taking the approach on the right. So this is like flexion, prone, heel to butt. Now I'm going to do it in the kneeling position because I think it just shows up visually a little bit better. So we're going right back to that first demonstration I just did, and then we're going to try and make a difference to this, okay? So if I look at that, okay, so here we are again. So here's, boom, 1990 position. I'm going to stay in this position. I'm not going to flex my hips or have any kind of, that's my passive range of motion, or my active range of motion currently. That's as far as I can go. Now, that means that this difference between here and here is quite significant. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a chair. Okay, now I could use a band. I could do this in a standing position. I could use a band and do this in a lying position and hold on to things overhead. But the chair is easy, low-hanging fruit. So if I think about it like this, okay, the more I move forward and the lower that chair is, the closer I am now to where my previous range of motion was. I still have lots of range of motion left to get yet. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to push down to the chair gently using my breath. Inhale, exhale, pushing down at about 30 to 40%. Exhale. I'm going to try and hold my foot off the chair from that range of motion without changing anything majorly in my upper body. So it's just that joint that I'm working on. So that's about the right range of motion for me right now. As that gets easier for me to do, so I'm going to try several reps at this one spot. Push down, pushing 30 degrees. Exhale. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So I'm going to work this range of motion until it improves a little bit, and then I'm going to work my way back. So I'm going to give myself a little bit more knee support here. So now I've got further up the chain. Okay, so at some point here, I'm not going to be able to get my foot off the chair, or I might even end up into a hamstring spasm. So same idea, pushing down gently, pushing into the chair. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Now I'm going to get a bit of assistance. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull down to get my core to fire. So I'm going to get some extra proximal stability, and then my hamstring will cramp. So we're in a place where my nervous system's a little bit unhappy about that pattern. So I may have to do a little bit of foam rolling or inhibitory type work to get to it. But this log, in this case I'm using the Viper, allows me to, like right now, if I'm in this position, I can't get my foot to come off that bench at this level of knee flexion. I pull down, all of a sudden I can engage that range of motion. Now it's really deep, so my hamstrings are firing in a spasmic kind of way because it's so confused. Over time, this will improve. So if you get a spasm while doing these end range of motion techniques, not to worry. Adding extra stability, core bracing, proximal stability will help you achieve distal joint flexibility and mobility, okay? So proximal stability, core bracing, something to pull on, push on, irradiation tension, white knuckling, whatever will help. So these are the little things that you can do to really enhance your experience. And what I like about this is that particularly a lot of this mobility work for me is either done as standalone, and in more times than not, it's done pre-workout. So I'm going to try and enhance a specific range of motion that's been assessed and needing to be addressed. So there, or I'm trying to just set them up to be safe in their workout, which means I'm in a preparation mindset, which means I want breathing to be strong. I want forced inhalation, forced exhalation. I want lots of proximal stability because I'm probably getting ready to do something explosive or strong in the upcoming blocks. So it's important to realize that pre-workout, these high tension techniques are great. Post-workout, standalone, sometimes low threshold techniques are going to be useful. So that was knee flexion. So this next one is called hip flexion. Okay, so now there's various ways. Again, same idea. Almost everyone I know will have this same type of issue. You can use chairs, you can use plyo boxes, et cetera, et cetera. If you can find something around your house or something at the gym that's about that right height where this position, that's your active range of motion, can be met so you can push down into something, that's awesome. So in this case, because I'm a big fan of this 30% of tension, I'm going to use the band. So the band's going to assist me up. I could have this band attached overhead. So, okay, here, first things first. So here's my active range of motion. Again, biomechanically, I want this foot to come up and then not corkscrewed or out to the side or any kind. I want this shin and foot to be directly under my knee. Okay, and I want this down leg to be reciprocally extended. So that's my start pattern, and that's as far as my knee will go actively. All right, I might be able to squeeze out another centimeter, but now what I'm going to do is I'm going to passively assist this further up. So my active passive range difference. So what I'm going to do is just grab onto this. Here's my active range. Again, here's my passive range. So I'm going to pull this up a little further. So that's now higher up, and then my job is to push down at that, because that's about 30% effort, and pull up and hold. Push down 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and pull up as high as I possibly can, extending further in this knee. Now what I can do now is add tension. So I'm going to push down, and I'm going to pull up. So I'm pressing down in this hand and holding this new position. Push down, 3, 2, 1, pull up. And I'm trying to get this knee to come up as high as it possibly can because I know there's an active passive range difference. This is my active range and that was my passive range. There was a difference between the two, and it's soft and spongy. There's not a hard end range available. I've got sponge at the end range. That tells me I can work on this. It's not a joint capsule issue. It's tissue contractile brain connection proprioception issue, and therefore I need to drive information into that joint at that range of motion. So that's hip flexion. Another great way to do that is just to put your foot up on a box, push down into the box, easy or hard, depending on where you are at, and then pulling up from that position. Again, the point of that is to always start from a new range of motion. That's why I like bands, because I can quickly establish a new range. I don't have to add plates under my feet for every repetition going forward. Whew, my glutes are jacked. Yeah, all right. So, I think we're getting the idea here. So this thing applies across the board. So you can see what I'm doing. I'm just taking some examples and moving up the chain a little. So this last example, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use horizontal abduction and adduction. So I could keep going with all kinds of examples, but I want you to just wrap your head around the concept and different ways you can do this from home or with your clients, even if you're doing it virtually. If you're just working on yourself, au naturel, if you're at a gym and you're, and hopefully we'll start to open up here again in the next little while. So this is a basic chest stretch, right? But a lot of people lack the ability because of head forward postures, rounded shoulders, various forms of over dominance to the front and under dominance to the back, end up with poor range of motion in the pecs, okay, or horizontal abduction. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to go. So here, for example, if I do this, I'm going to keep my hips squared forward. Okay, my hips are forward. That is my range of motion. Okay, so there's various ways to look at this, but if I allow my torso to rotate as well, okay, so hips are forward and squared to the front. And then from the, actually, how about I do this? Doesn't matter, I'll do it this way. So hips are forward, my thorax is rotated, my shoulder now will be maximally, so this is the most range of motion with my hips staying forward. That's as much range of motion as I have available to me, okay? Now, if I start to walk that through, I have an active passive range difference. So if someone was here to assist me, but you can see now the range of motion I have available to me is higher. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull into, gently pull, 30%, 5, 4, locking the shoulders down, managing the mechanics, 3, and then I'm going to try and pull away, 5, 4, maximum energy, 3, 2, 1. Take a little break. Reset that pattern. Go until I feel a little bit of a stretch. So I'm going to try and get back to that position I was just in. Hips again forward. So I like to stagger that 1 foot forward a little bit. Inhale. Exhale. Pull away from the wall. 5, 4. And I'm really trying to make this feel this in that middle upper back right under my scapula. 2 and 1. So I'm going to establish that position. I'm going to keep rotating my shoulders forward as much as I possibly can. Keep the hip forward as much as I possibly can. Inhale. Exhale. Exhale. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. The amount of work I have going down in my rhomboids in my lower trap area right now to try and manage that shoulder position, it's incredibly high. So again, simple things, but like I'm sweating, okay? And these aren't some of the harder ones. Some of the harder ones are far more interesting than this. So I've got a lot more examples of this stuff. I'm going to continue to post some of these active passive range techniques over the next week or two. So one at a time on my Instagram channel, which is at Prepare to Perform. Some of them I will probably post onto YouTube as well, which some of you are probably looking at right now. And obviously I'll post it on the Personal Trainers Network. So watch out for additional techniques using the active passive range, and using different variations of that methodology to achieve a narrowing of the active passive range difference and getting rid of what's called the neurological dead zone. So there's 3 great examples. Hopefully this will sort of get your brain fired up early in the week. I'm sorry, obviously there's a lot of theory built into all this stuff, and it's hard to glaze over it without people just thinking, okay, well, why does this actually work, or what's the thought process that goes into it, because I think it's incredibly important. So here's some more examples I took from the FRC course. So there's the one I just demonstrated. Another one's the spinal rotation, so you can do self-spinal rotation. So if you're seated, pull yourself around, push back into it, pull yourself further around, continuing to establish more rotation. So great transverse plane exercise, great spinal rotation exercise. Obviously, it stretches out the glutes and stuff as well, but it's a great kinetic chain, spinal rotation, spiral rotation pattern, which is awesome. There's so many versions of this kind of stuff that you can sort of, again, start to play with it. Right? And if you try something cool, or if you got one in your toolbox that's similar to this, and then something in today's seminar has triggered a thought process for you, make sure you tag me at repair, the word repair, to fix something to perform on Instagram, or on my Facebook channel, on this channel that you're watching it on, etc. Make comments, post something really cool, show me your variations of these things, and I'd be super excited to see it. So anyway, if we start getting into the bandit concept here, okay, so one of the things that's useful from a band perspective is that if you get the band in the right spot, so a lot of us have done some of this band range of motion stuff, was made pretty popular by Kelly Starrett of Mobility Wads. And God, Kelly, I'm sorry, but I know you've got a different name to your Instagram account right now, but everyone knows who the Supple Leopard King is. So if you start looking at some of those bandit techniques, you can start getting into ideas of the same concept where you're going to have this, right, contract to 30, and then let the band pull it out, get in a position with the hip flexors. So for example, I'll do this very lightly, just really quick to finish this off. I mean, obviously the chair is not anchored, so I'm going to be very careful with this so the chair doesn't move around. But I've got this anchored now, so if I'm in a low anchor point in a hip flex position, this is going to distract the hip out of the socket a little bit, create some space in the hip socket. And that's not always the way. Sometimes you need compression versus decompression. So in this case, I'm creating a little bit of a tension that drags the femur down away from the acetabulum, or the hip socket. And then that tension, meaning like a slightly higher band than this, then moving forward into a hip flexor stretch allows me to create more space. And then I can fire into the floor, active, right? So I pull my knee forward, let the band do its work from a perspective there, and then I can drive forward into the pattern. Pull forward, exhale, and fire my glute, fire the glute, and try and move farther forward. Pull, fire the hip flexors, 30%, 40%, exhale, sink deeper into the pattern. So with the bands, you can get the assistance of joint space. So we can find ways to help manipulate the joint space. Again, if you want more information on how to use bands to create joint space, distraction around the joints, Kelly Start of the Supple Leopard will be a great resource for you. So that's pretty much all I'm going to cover today. Got a couple more slides here, but I'll leave it there. So really appreciate you guys coming on, watching all this stuff today. I know I didn't flip in and out of the screen share, and that's partly because I don't have an extra person here supporting me while doing this. So stopping to share. Here we go. So anyway, I know it's probably pretty small on the screen for some of those demonstrations, but I think you get the general idea. And again, log into my Instagram account, stay tuned here on Facebook and all the other places where I could post information on my social channels, and I will make sure that I get some of this stuff out to you, technique by technique, piece by piece, joint by joint, and hopefully will help turn you into a much more mobile individual capable of moving effectively, efficiently, pain-free, and be able to do the things that you really enjoy in life and sports. So peace. Hope you enjoyed it a little bit. Fire the questions away on the Facebook channel. Fire questions into the YouTube channel, and I'll make sure I get back to you in the next few days. Thank you very much. Be safe.